Tonight, I invite you to relax, unwind, and drift into a peaceful slumber as I guide you through a calming bedtime story. Let go of the day's worries, settle into a comfortable position, and allow the gentle rhythm of my voice to lull you into a deep, restful sleep. This story is designed to quiet your mind, ease your body, and transport you to a world of serenity and dreams. So take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, ready to embrace the tranquility of the night. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the story begin. The Widow in the Dusk Story. The small town of Willowbrook is shaken when Arthur Whitmore, a beloved retired librarian, passes away suddenly. His widow, Maggie, tries to adjust to life alone. But one evening, while out for a walk at dusk, she sees something, or someone, lurking near her garden. Chapter 1. A Visitor in the Fog. Maggie tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she stepped onto the back porch, inhaling the damp scent of the morning air. The fog had settled thick over the fields, curling around the trees and swallowing the gravel path leading toward the woods. It was one of those mornings where the world felt smaller, as if it existed only within the mist's embrace. She took a tentative step down, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. As she turned toward her small vegetable garden, something caught her eye. There, in the dewy grass just beyond the steps, was a trail of footprints. Maggie frowned. They weren't hers, nor were they Lucy's. The prints were too large, too deep. Her mind flickered through the possibilities. Perhaps a passerby had strayed too close to the property, or maybe just an animal. But as she crouched closer, she could make out the defined edges of a boot print. Someone had been walking through her yard, and recently. She straightened, shaking off a shiver that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. She was being silly. This house, nestled at the edge of town, saw the occasional hunter or lost traveler. No need to make something out of nothing. Still, as she turned back toward the house, she cast one last glance at the footprints before heading inside. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, her long brown hair spilling over her shoulders as she tapped away at her phone. A half-eaten plate of toast sat next to her, forgotten. "Morning, Gran," she said without looking up. "Morning, dear." Maggie busied herself with the kettle, willing away the unease in her stomach. "Did you sleep well?" Lucy shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. I thought I heard something in the night, though." Maggie's hand froze mid-pour. "What do you mean?" Lucy looked up then, pushing her phone aside. "Like footsteps?" "I don't know, maybe I dreamed it, but I woke up around 3 and could have sworn I heard someone outside." A chill crept up Maggie's spine, but she forced a smile. "Probably an animal," she said lightly. "Nothing to worry about." Lucy didn't look convinced, but she let it go, returning her attention to her phone. Maggie took her tea to the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one that used to be Arthur's study. The room had been untouched since his passing, a quiet sanctuary of books and memories. She rarely ventured in, but this morning, an odd impulse drew her there. As soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air felt disturbed. The heavy oak desk, once pristine, had a stack of papers knocked askew. The small wooden box Arthur used to keep his letters was slightly open, the contents shuffled. She ran a finger over the surface of the desk, noticing a spot that had been wiped clean, as if someone had hastily removed something. Maggie's breath quickened. This wasn't her doing, and Lucy never came in here. Her gaze flickered to the window, slightly ajar. It had been locked last she checked. The footprints, the noises in the night, and now this. Someone had been in her house. "I told you something was up," Lucy said, her eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Maggie had recounted her discovery, and now they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the air between them charged with unspoken questions. "I don't like this," Maggie murmured, gripping her cup of tea. It could have been a burglar, but why only Arthur's study? Lucy leaned forward. Maybe they were looking for something specific. That's what I'm afraid of. Maggie's gaze drifted to the back door. But what would anyone want from this house? There's nothing of value here. Lucy's mind was already racing. Arthur was a historian, right? Maybe he had something important? Maggie frowned. Important? He collected old books, wrote essays on local history. Nothing anyone would break in for. Lucy tapped her fingers on the table. What about that wooden box? Did you check if anything was missing? Maggie's stomach turned. I didn't look closely. Lucy stood. Then let's go. Maggie hesitated, but the determination in her granddaughter's eyes was unwavering. With a sigh, she followed Lucy back into the study. The box sat where she left it, its lid slightly ajar. Maggie's hands trembled as she lifted it. Inside were the usual contents: letters, a few faded photographs, an old pocket watch. But then she noticed something odd. A folded piece of parchment tucked beneath the letters. She didn't remember seeing it before. Maggie carefully unfolded the fragile paper, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled in Arthur's familiar handwriting. If something happens to me, find the ledger. You know where to look. Her heart pounded. What ledger? And why would Arthur leave such a cryptic note? Lucy hovered over her shoulder. Gran, what does it mean? Maggie shook her head. I don't know, but if someone was searching for this... She swallowed hard. It means they haven't found it yet. Lucy's eyes gleamed with determination. Then we need to find it first. Maggie hesitated. Lucy, this could be dangerous. If someone broke in looking for this, they might come back. Lucy squared her shoulders. And if we don't figure this out, they'll keep trying. Maggie sighed, rubbing her temples. Her granddaughter had always been headstrong, just like Arthur. There would be no talking her out of this. All right, Maggie murmured, but we have to be careful. Lucy grinned. So where do we start? Maggie stared at the note, then at the study, her mind sifting through the years of memories. Arthur had a habit of hiding things in plain sight, she said softly. If he wanted to keep something safe, he would have hidden it somewhere only I would think to look. Her gaze drifted toward the tall bookshelf lining the far wall, Arthur's pride and joy. Lucy followed her line of sight. You think it's in there? Maggie nodded. If there's a ledger, that's where it would be. Lucy cracked her knuckles. Then let's start looking. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were already running out of time. Somewhere in the fog, someone was still watching. Chapter 2. A Clue in the Library. The library smelled of old paper and time itself, filled with the lingering essence of memories long past. Rows upon rows of books lined the towering shelves, and dust swirled lazily in the dim golden light that filtered through the curtained windows. Maggie stood before the large bookshelf in Arthur's old study, her fingers running gently over the spines of books that had gone untouched for years. Lucy stood beside her, eyes scanning titles with curiosity. Grandpa had good taste, Lucy murmured, picking up a leather-bound volume of the Odyssey. Maggie smiled faintly. He always believed books held more secrets than people did. Lucy flipped through the pages, pausing as a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. She bent down, picking up the fragile yellowed note. Her brows furrowed as she unfolded it. "Grandma, look at this." Maggie turned. Lucy held up the note, her voice quiet but urgent as she read aloud. "The past never sleeps. Find the letters." A silence settled between them. Maggie took the note carefully, her heart pounding. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Arthur's. "Letters?" Lucy asked. Did Grandpa write letters to someone? Maggie's mind raced. Arthur had never mentioned anything about secret letters, but then again, he had always been a private man. Thoughtful, cautious. And now, even in death, he seemed to be guiding them towards something. "We need to figure out what he meant," Maggie said finally. Lucy nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "Where do we start?" Maggie exhaled, staring at the note as if it might offer more answers. "I think we should take this to the police, just in case." "Seriously?" Lucy looked skeptical. "You think Grandpa's, warning us?" Maggie hesitated. "I don't know. But if someone was searching the study and now we find this..." She trailed off. "It doesn't feel like a coincidence." Lucy glanced back at the bookshelf, then at her grandmother. "All right, let's go." Detective Peter Calloway. The police station smelled of burnt coffee and cheap cologne. Detective Peter Calloway sat at his desk, idly flipping through paperwork while listening to the hum of the station around him. He was young for his position, just past 30, with sharp blue eyes that often betrayed his easygoing demeanor. The town wasn't exactly a hotbed of crime, and most of his days were spent filing reports on stolen bicycles or neighborly disputes over property lines. So when Maggie and Lucy walked into the station, he straightened with mild interest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted with a smile. "What can I do for you?" Maggie sat down across from him, Lucy beside her. She slid the note across the desk. "We found this in my late husband's library," Maggie said. "It was hidden inside one of his books." Calloway picked up the note, reading the words aloud. "The past never sleeps. Find the letters." He raised an eyebrow. "Sounds dramatic." Lucy crossed her arms. "We think it might be connected to something." Calloway leaned back, tapping the note against his desk. "I don't doubt that your husband was a man of intellect, Mrs. Whitmore, but this sounds more like a scavenger hunt than a crime." Maggie met his gaze steadily. "Someone broke into my house, Detective." That made Calloway pause. "Really?" Lucy nodded. "They went through Grandpa's study. Nothing was taken, at least not that we can tell. But someone was looking for something." Calloway exhaled, drumming his fingers on the desk. "All right, let's assume this is serious. Do you have any idea what the letters might refer to?" Maggie shook her head. "Arthur never mentioned them, but he left this note for a reason. And if someone was searching for something in our home, I don't think we should ignore it." Calloway studied the note again, then sighed, rubbing his temple. "Okay. Let's say there's something to this. Do you know if your husband had any correspondences, old letters, documents?" Maggie hesitated. "He did receive letters now and then, but he never kept them in plain sight." "Could they be in the house somewhere?" Calloway asked. Maggie thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If he hid them, they'd be somewhere important, somewhere he thought no one would look." Lucy snapped her fingers. "Like the library!" Calloway smirked. "Seems like a fitting place for hidden letters." Maggie pushed her chair back. "Then that's where we start." The search. Back at the house, Maggie and Lucy wasted no time. The study felt different now, alive with purpose rather than grief. Lucy started pulling books from the shelves, flipping through pages for any sign of hidden papers. Maggie checked drawers, feeling along the edges for secret compartments. Hours passed with no luck. Lucy collapsed onto the old leather chair, groaning. "I don't get it. If Grandpa left that note, he must have known someone would find it. So where are the letters?" Maggie sat back, thinking. Her eyes roamed the room, landing on Arthur's desk. It was where he had spent most of his time, where he had written his thoughts, drafted his essays, and kept his most precious notes. She stood suddenly, moving to the desk. "What if—" Maggie trailed off as she ran her hands along the underside of the top drawer. A small click. Lucy shot up. "Did you just—" Maggie pulled the drawer all the way out, and beneath it, taped to the bottom, was a thick envelope. Her hands trembled as she peeled it away, turning it over. Arthur's handwriting. Lucy leaned in, heart racing. "Open it." Maggie carefully unfolded the flap and pulled out a stack of letters, yellowed with age. She scanned the first one, her eyes widening. "My God," she whispered. Lucy's pulse quickened. "What? What does it say?" Maggie swallowed hard. These aren't just any letters. They're about something Arthur was researching. Lucy frowned. Researching what? Maggie's hands tightened around the papers. A murder. The truth unfolds. At the police station, Calloway read the letters in silence. His usual smirk had vanished, replaced with a focused intensity. They're about a case from decades ago, he murmured. A local disappearance, a man named Benjamin Holt. Lucy leaned forward. And Grandpa was investigating it? Calloway nodded. Looks that way. Holt was presumed dead, but his body was never found. Your grandfather seemed to believe there was more to the story. Maggie sat stiffly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Do you think this is why someone broke in? Calloway exhaled. If someone knew Arthur was looking into this, maybe they think these letters hold answers. He tapped a page. One of these mentions a name, someone Arthur thought was responsible. Lucy tensed. Who? Calloway turned the letter toward them. The name was written in Arthur's careful script. Harold Kent. Maggie's breath hitched. He was the mayor back then, she said quietly. A very powerful man. Calloway leaned back in his chair, processing. This just went from a mystery to a real case. Lucy met his gaze. Do you believe us now? Calloway smirked. I think I do. He placed the letters into a folder, locking eyes with Maggie. And I think we just uncovered something bigger than we ever expected. Here's a draft for Chapter 3 of your story. Chapter 3, The Mysterious Mr. Grayson. Maggie first noticed him on a crisp autumn afternoon. The moving truck rumbled down Sycamore Lane, stopping in front of the old Prescott house, a place that had sat empty for nearly 2 years. She watched from her porch, mug in hand, as a tall, lean man stepped out of a dark sedan. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his movements deliberate. He didn't greet the neighbors, didn't pause to admire the quaint charm of the street. He simply disappeared inside, closing the door firmly behind him. Over the next few days, Maggie saw him only in brief glimpses. He left early in the mornings, always dressed in a dark coat, and returned late in the evenings. He never lingered outside, never joined in the casual conversations that often took place at the local market. It was as if he wanted to go unnoticed, but Maggie noticed. She wasn't the only one. Mrs. Ellison, the self-appointed town gossip, brought up the newcomer at the bakery one morning. He doesn't have much to say, she whispered to Maggie over a display of fresh scones. Polite but distant. Said his name is Thomas Grayson. That's all I could get out of him. Maggie nodded, but something about the name unsettled her. She couldn't place why. It wasn't until she made a routine stop at the town archives that her unease turned to alarm. Maggie had always been a regular at the small, dusty building, searching through old documents and photographs, trying to piece together parts of the town's history. Arthur's history. She liked knowing where he had come from, what shaped him before they met. That day she had just stepped inside when she saw him. Thomas Grayson stood at the counter flipping through a stack of records. He didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in what he was reading. But when the librarian handed him a folder, Maggie caught the name written across the top. Arthur Whitmore, her late husband. Maggie felt her breath hitch. She stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice steady. Grayson turned to face her. Up close, his features were sharper. Deep-set eyes, a strong jaw, and an expression that was impossible to read. Maggie lifted her chin. "Why are you looking into my husband?" For a moment he didn't respond. Then, in a voice low and measured, he said, "I suppose you could say I have my reasons." Maggie's fingers curled into her coat pocket. "I'd like to hear them," she said. Grayson hesitated, then offered a small, almost knowing smile. "In time, Mrs. Whitmore." Then, just like that, he turned, tucked the file under his arm, and walked out of the archives, leaving Maggie standing there, heart pounding, mind racing, and more suspicious than ever. Chapter 4. The Secret Letters. Maggie sat at the edge of the worn-out armchair, the dim light of the study casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The scent of old paper and dust filled the room as Lucy carefully unfolded one of the yellowed letters. A chill ran down Maggie's spine as she glanced at her late husband's familiar handwriting, elegant but rushed, as if he had written in haste. Arthur had always been a secretive man, but Maggie had never imagined he had secrets this deep. With Lucy's sharp, investigative mind, they had managed to unearth a hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of Arthur's desk. Inside had been a bundle of letters, bound together with a frayed red ribbon. The discovery had left Maggie both breathless and terrified. Lucy, her young face illuminated by the glow of the desk lamp, furrowed her brow as she read the first few lines aloud. June 12th, 1987. To whomever finds this, there is something happening in this town that cannot be ignored. I have tried to go to the authorities, but I quickly realized that some matters are meant to be buried. The truth, however, does not stay buried forever. If I disappear, know that I tried. Know that I did not remain silent. Lucy's voice wavered. "Maggie, this is serious." Maggie clutched the arm of the chair. What on earth did Arthur get himself into? They read further. The letters, dated from decades ago, detailed Arthur's involvement in a mystery that had never been made public. A forgotten disappearance. In the summer of 1987, Arthur had apparently been investigating the sudden disappearance of a local girl named Eleanor Finch. According to his letters, Eleanor had vanished without a trace, and though whispers of foul play had circulated in town, there had never been a police report, no missing person posters, no investigation. It was as if she had never existed at all. Maggie's hands trembled as she pulled out an old newspaper clipping tucked between the letters. The date matched the year Arthur had written about, but there was no mention of Eleanor in the paper. Instead, the headline read, "Local factory burns down, no injuries reported." She frowned. A fire? Lucy leaned over, scanning the article. If this was around the same time Eleanor disappeared, do you think it's connected? Maggie hesitated. Arthur seemed to think so. One of the later letters detailed his suspicions. He believed Eleanor had discovered something she wasn't supposed to, something tied to the factory. "I know I'm being watched," Arthur had written. "I see the same black car parked outside my shop at odd hours. I hear footsteps behind me when I walk home. Someone doesn't want me looking into this, but I can't stop. I owe it to her." Maggie felt her breath catch. She had been married to Arthur for 20 years before his passing, yet he had never spoken of any of this. How much of his life had been a mystery to her? Lucy sat back, deep in thought. If the police never investigated, that means someone with power kept it quiet. Do you think Eleanor's family knew what happened? Maggie shook her head. "I don't even remember anyone by that name. It's like she was erased." The last letter. As they read through the final letter, Arthur's words grew more frantic. "I met with someone who claims to have proof that Eleanor was taken, not just missing. They're afraid to speak publicly, but they've given me something. I can't write it down. It's too dangerous. But if anything happens to me, look for the key. It's the only way to the truth." Maggie and Lucy exchanged a look. "A key?" Lucy whispered. Maggie suddenly recalled something. Years ago, she had found an old key tucked away in Arthur's watch case. When she had asked him about it, he had simply smiled and said, "Just an old souvenir." Her heart pounded. What if that key was still in the house? She rushed to the bedroom, Lucy following close behind. Pulling open the drawer of Arthur's old nightstand, she rummaged through its contents. Old receipts, a few stray buttons, a broken pocket watch. And then, buried beneath a stack of papers, she found it. A small brass key. She turned to Lucy. "We need to find what this unlocks." The truth beneath their feet. The next day, Maggie and Lucy began their search. Arthur's letters mentioned that he had hidden something important, something that could prove Eleanor's fate. But where? After scouring Arthur's study, the basement, and the garage, they found nothing. It wasn't until Maggie leaned against the bookshelf in frustration that she heard it, an odd creak. Lucy's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" They pushed against the shelf, and to their astonishment, it budged. Behind it was a small, locked compartment. Maggie's hands shook as she inserted the key. With a soft click, the compartment opened, revealing a single item, a leather-bound journal. Inside, Arthur had documented everything. Eleanor's last known whereabouts, witness statements, and most importantly, a name. William Hargrove. Maggie gasped. Hargrove had been the owner of the factory that burned down. He had been a respected businessman, but according to Arthur's notes, he had been involved in something far more sinister. The final entry in the journal sent chills through Maggie's body. "Hargrove knows I'm on to him. He thinks I don't have proof, but I do. Eleanor never ran away. She never left town. She's buried beneath the old factory. If anyone finds this, don't let him get away with it." Maggie stared at the page, her heart pounding. Arthur had known all these years. He had known where Eleanor's body was, and he had never told anyone. Lucy exhaled shakily. Maggie, your husband was trying to bring a killer to justice. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. She had spent years thinking she knew Arthur. Now she realized he had carried this burden alone. Justice, at last. Armed with the journal, Maggie and Lucy took their findings to the authorities. With renewed interest, the police reopened the case, and within weeks, forensic teams uncovered human remains beneath the old factory ruins. DNA confirmed the worst. Eleanor Finch had never left town. The case sent shockwaves through the community. William Hargrove, now an aging man in his 70s, was arrested and charged with murder. Under pressure, he finally confessed. Eleanor had discovered illegal dealings at the factory, and to keep her silent, Hargrove had her killed. Then, using his influence, he had erased her existence. Arthur had been right all along. As Maggie stood at her husband's grave, she whispered, "You did it, Arthur. She's finally at peace." She placed the letters beside the headstone, letting the wind carry away the weight of secrets long buried. Chapter 5. The Mayor's Hidden Past. The wind howled through the old town of Fairhaven, rattling the windows of the library where Lucy and Maggie pored over the yellowed pages of Arthur's letters. They had spent weeks tracing the cryptic messages the old man had left behind, each clue leading them deeper into a mystery that had long been buried. But tonight, they had uncovered something far more sinister than they had expected. Maggie ran a hand through her hair, eyes darting between the letter in her hands and the stack of documents they'd pulled from the town's archives. "Lucy, look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arthur mentions a Franklin several times in his letters, and he's not just any Franklin. He's talking about Franklin Hodges." Lucy frowned, flipping through an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Young Man Vanishes Without a Trace. 1975. She glanced at the byline. It was an article from the Fairhaven Gazette, dated nearly 5 decades ago. Below the headline was a black and white photo of a young man in his early 20s, smiling awkwardly at the camera. His name was Daniel Carter. Maggie leaned closer, pointing at a part of Arthur's letter. "Franklin was there that night. I saw him with my own eyes. He knew what happened to Daniel, but no one ever asked the right questions." Lucy's breath hitched. "Franklin Hodges, our mayor?" Maggie nodded grimly. Fairhaven's mayor, Franklin Hodges, was a beloved figure in town. He had served for nearly 20 years, always seen as a respectable and trustworthy leader. But if Arthur's letters were telling the truth, he was hiding a secret. One that dated back to the night Daniel Carter disappeared. The two exchanged a look of understanding. They had to find out what happened that night. The next morning, Lucy and Maggie visited the town records office. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Langley, peered at them suspiciously over her glasses when they asked for any police reports from 1975. "Whatever for?" she asked. "We're researching an old case," Lucy replied. A disappearance. Mrs. Langley hesitated before slowly making her way to the back of the archive room. After a few moments, she returned with a dusty folder. "Here's what we have," she said. Maggie took the folder and opened it, scanning the faded documents. Daniel Carter was last seen near the lake on September 12, 1975, she read aloud. Witnesses reported seeing him arguing with another young man, but the identity of that person was never confirmed. Lucy pointed to a name listed under interviewed witnesses. "Arthur Beaumont. That's Arthur." Maggie's eyes darkened. "And look at this." She flipped the page, revealing a short statement signed by a young Franklin Hodges. He was questioned, but his statement was vague. He claimed he left early and saw nothing. A sinking feeling settled in Lucy's stomach. Arthur must have known the truth. That's why he wrote those letters. Determined to uncover more, they decided to confront Mayor Hodges directly. The next afternoon, they attended a town hall meeting, waiting until the mayor had finished his agenda before approaching him. Mayor Hodges was a man in his 70s now, but his presence was still commanding. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he wore a tailored suit that spoke of years in office. When he saw Lucy and Maggie, he greeted them with a polite but wary smile. "What can I do for you two?" he asked. Maggie handed him a copy of Arthur's letter. "We found this in Arthur Beaumont's belongings. It mentions you." The mayor's expression stiffened. He read the letter carefully before folding it and placing it on the table. "Arthur was a troubled man in his old age," he said dismissively. "I wouldn't put too much stock in his ramblings." Lucy wasn't convinced. "He wasn't rambling. He left us these letters because he wanted someone to uncover the truth about Daniel Carter's disappearance." For a brief moment, something flickered in Hodges's eyes, something between anger and fear. "That was nearly 50 years ago," he said firmly. "It's in the past." Maggie didn't back down. "But you were there that night, weren't you?" The mayor let out a slow breath. "This isn't something I want to discuss." "But you have to," Lucy pressed, "because Arthur spent his last days trying to bring this secret to light." Hodges looked at them both, his jaw clenched. Finally he sighed and gestured for them to follow him to his office. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against his desk. "I never meant for things to go the way they did," he admitted. "Daniel and I were friends. At least we were once." Maggie crossed her arms. "So what happened?" The mayor hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Daniel was in love with my sister, Margaret." Lucy's eyes widened. "Your sister?" Hodges nodded. "My father disapproved. He thought Daniel wasn't good enough for her. But Margaret didn't care. She wanted to run away with him." He looked down at his hands. "That night at the lake, I tried to talk him out of it. I told him my father would never allow it." Lucy felt her pulse quicken. "Did you fight?" Hodges exhaled sharply. "Yes, I was young, reckless, angry. We shoved each other. He tripped and hit his head on a rock." His voice cracked. "I panicked. I thought he was dead." Maggie's hands curled into fists. So you covered it up? The mayor nodded, his face pale. I dragged his body into the lake. I told everyone he just disappeared. Margaret never forgave me. She left town and never came back. Lucy swallowed hard. Arthur knew. Yes, the mayor admitted. He was there that night. He saw everything. But he promised to keep my secret. He looked at them with pleading eyes. I never meant to kill him. It was an accident. Maggie's voice was cold. That doesn't change the fact that you let people believe Daniel just vanished. His family never got closure. The mayor's shoulders sagged. I know. And I've lived with that guilt for decades. Silence filled the room. Finally, Lucy spoke. The truth has to come out. Hodges let out a shaky breath. He nodded. I know. I'll go to the authorities. Maggie and Lucy exchanged glances. Arthur had spent his final days making sure the truth was uncovered. And now, after nearly 50 years, justice would finally be served. As they left the mayor's office, Lucy looked up at the evening sky. Arthur did it, she murmured. He made sure the past wasn't forgotten. Maggie nodded. And now Fairhaven will finally know the truth. The wind whispered through the streets as if carrying Arthur's last message. The past had finally been unearthed, and the weight of its secrets was no longer buried. Chapter 6. A Midnight Chase. Maggie lay in bed, the soft hum of the night settling around her. The old house creaked and sighed as it always did, settling into the darkness. She had lived here long enough to know every sound, every moan of the wooden beams, every whisper of the wind through the trees. But tonight, something was different. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't imagining it. There was someone in the house. Heart pounding, she reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers shaking. She had been dismissed too many times before, by the police, by her friends, even by herself. But she knew what she had heard. Slowly she pushed back the covers and slid out of bed, keeping her steps as light as possible. Another creak. Closer this time. She wasn't alone. Maggie tiptoed toward her bedroom door, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide. But she had to see. She had to know. She cracked the door open just a fraction, enough to peer out into the dark hallway. A shadow moved. She gasped, stumbling backward. The sound must have alerted whoever was out there, because the next thing she heard was the rapid thud of footsteps, retreating fast. Maggie bolted after them. She reached the staircase just in time to see a dark figure slipping through the front door. It closed behind them with a barely audible click, as if whoever it was had expected to be chased, but didn't want to make a scene. Maggie, a voice, groggy and confused, called from the guest room. Lucy. Maggie's best friend had been staying with her for the past few nights, offering a reassuring presence after weeks of paranoia. Someone was here, Maggie whispered harshly, barely pausing before yanking open the door and rushing onto the porch. Lucy was right behind her. The night air was crisp, the full moon casting eerie shadows across the yard. Maggie scanned the darkness, her pulse hammering in her ears. And then, movement. "There!" Lucy hissed, pointing toward the back fence. A shadow darted through the garden, fast and agile, moving toward the woods beyond the property. "Come on!" Maggie didn't think, she just ran. Her bare feet slapped against the cold ground as she sprinted after the intruder. Lucy followed close behind, but the figure was fast, weaving between trees, disappearing and reappearing between beams of moonlight. Maggie pushed herself harder, branches whipping against her arms as she forced her way through the dense underbrush. The figure was just ahead now, stumbling slightly. He hadn't expected to be chased this far. Then, as if realizing he was losing ground, the figure veered sharply to the right. Maggie saw it too late. The ground disappeared beneath her. With a cry, she tumbled down a small ravine, the world spinning. She landed hard, her breath whooshing from her lungs. "Maggie!" Lucy's voice was distant, panicked. Maggie groaned, rolling onto her side. A dull pain throbbed in her ribs, but she forced herself up. The figure was gone. She cursed under her breath, glancing around, trying to find any sign of where they had gone. And then something glinted in the moonlight. A footprint. Lucy slid down the ravine, breathless. "Are you okay?" Maggie nodded, barely hearing her. She knelt beside the footprint, heart pounding. The print was deep, well-defined, left behind in a patch of damp earth. The shoe's pattern looked familiar, too familiar. Maggie's blood ran cold. She had seen this tread before. Not in a catalog, not on a stranger. On Thomas Grayson. By the time they made it back to the house, Detective Calloway was pulling up in his cruiser, his headlights illuminating the front yard. He stepped out, his usual air of detached skepticism replaced with something else. Concern. "You actually showed up this time," Maggie said, breathing heavily, her arms wrapped around herself to keep from shaking. Calloway ignored the jab. "You said you saw someone?" Lucy nodded. Maggie chased him into the woods. He was fast, but she got close enough to see something important. Maggie swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The footprint. It matches Thomas Grayson's shoes. Calloway's expression darkened. Thomas Grayson. The name had been whispered in the shadows of the case for weeks now. He was charming, wealthy, well-respected, a businessman with no apparent reason to be involved in any of this. And yet, his name kept surfacing. First in whispers, then in passing accusations. Now there was proof. Calloway crouched near the garden, shining his flashlight over the dirt. The footprint was still there, clear as day. He let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "Okay," he said. "Now we're getting somewhere." For the first time, he looked at Maggie not with doubt, but with something close to belief. But Maggie didn't feel relieved. Because if Thomas Grayson had been sneaking around her house in the middle of the night, it meant one thing. She was getting too close to something, and he knew it. Somewhere across town, in a dimly lit room, Thomas Grayson sat in silence. A glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him, untouched. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the wood, his jaw tight. She had seen too much. Maggie was smart. Smarter than he had given her credit for. She hadn't let it go, hadn't backed down. That meant it was time to stop playing games. It was time to deal with her. For good. Chapter 7. Eleanor Knows Everything. Maggie Whittaker had always considered Eleanor Barnes a harmless busybody. The elderly woman lived next door, perched on her front porch like a queen on her throne, watching the town of Fairhaven unfold before her. Nothing escaped her notice, which was why, when Eleanor invited Maggie over for tea with an unmistakable twinkle in her eye, Maggie knew she was about to hear something juicy. Eleanor poured steaming chamomile tea into delicate china cups, the floral scent mingling with the cinnamon cookies she had set out. Maggie took a seat at the small round table in Eleanor's immaculately kept kitchen, waiting for her to get to the point. "You've been asking questions about Thomas Grayson, haven't you?" Eleanor said, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. Maggie stiffened, gripping her cup. "Who told you that?" Eleanor chuckled. "Oh, honey, people talk. And I listen. More than that, I see things. And I saw something the night before Thomas disappeared." Maggie's heart thudded. Thomas Grayson, a local journalist, had vanished 2 weeks ago. He'd been investigating something big, and now Eleanor was claiming she knew something about it. "What did you see?" Maggie asked, leaning in. Eleanor glanced toward the window as if expecting someone to be listening. Satisfied they were alone, she lowered her voice. "That night I was having trouble sleeping. My arthritis keeps me up, you know. I went out for a walk, just around the block. When I passed by the old train station, I saw 2 men standing under the lamplight." She paused, letting the suspense build. "One of them was Mayor Hodges." Maggie inhaled sharply. "The mayor?" "Yes. And the other man was Thomas Grayson." A chill ran down Maggie's spine. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." The mayor was agitated, gesturing a lot with his hands. Thomas was holding something, a folder, maybe a notebook. He looked serious, but not afraid. Not yet, anyway. I wanted to get closer, but I didn't dare. Eleanor sighed. "I walked away before they noticed me, and the next morning Thomas was gone." Maggie stared at Eleanor, her mind racing. "Did you tell the police?" Eleanor scoffed. "Of course not. The mayor runs this town." "And the police?" "They're either in his pocket or too afraid to cross him." Maggie's stomach twisted. If the mayor was the last person seen with Thomas, he might know what happened to him. What if... She hesitated, the thought too dark to say aloud. What if he made sure Thomas disappeared? Eleanor finished for her, her voice grim. Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of the possibility settle over her. If Thomas had evidence of something incriminating, the mayor might have wanted to shut him up. Eleanor tapped a wrinkled finger on the table. Exactly. And Thomas wasn't the first to poke around Mayor Hodges's business. Do you remember Peter Langley? Maggie's brow furrowed. The city planner? He died in a car accident last year. Eleanor nodded slowly. A very convenient accident. He had been questioning some of the mayor's land deals. Then poof, gone. Maggie's throat felt dry. You're saying the mayor is silencing people? I'm saying, Eleanor said, folding her hands neatly, that people who get too close to the mayor's secrets have a way of disappearing. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. If Eleanor was right, then Thomas had uncovered something dangerous. And if Maggie kept digging, she might be next. A sudden knock at the door made both women jump. Eleanor's face turned pale. Maggie turned to look. Through the window she could make out the silhouette of a tall figure standing on the porch. Another knock, harder this time. "Are you expecting someone?" Maggie whispered. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes wide. Maggie swallowed hard and stood, her pulse hammering as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door and gasped. Chapter 8: The Final Clue. Lucy's fingers trembled as she held the worn slip of paper, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. The words, "Justice is buried where we used to dream," stared back at her, written in Arthur's careful, slanted handwriting. She had found the note tucked inside the lining of an old leather journal, buried beneath a pile of forgotten books in the attic. The journal belonged to Arthur, her late grandfather, a man who had spent his final years whispering half-truths and riddles no one took seriously. But now, holding the note, Lucy knew he had meant for someone to find it. Maggie, Lucy's older sister, leaned over her shoulder, rereading the words aloud. "Where we used to dream," she murmured, and then her breath caught. "The oak tree," she said suddenly, turning to Lucy with wide eyes. "That old oak tree in the backyard, remember? That's where he always wrote. He used to tell us it was his thinking place." Lucy's pulse quickened. "Do you really think—" "There's only one way to find out." The late autumn sky had turned gray by the time they made their way to the backyard. The oak tree loomed ahead, its thick branches nearly bare, save for a few stubborn golden leaves. The ground beneath it was damp from last night's rain, the smell of earth rich and pungent. "This feels insane," Lucy muttered as she grabbed a small shovel from the shed. "Maybe," Maggie admitted. "But if Arthur wanted us to find something here, we owe it to him to at least try." They started digging at the base of the tree, pushing away damp soil and tangled roots. The work was slow, their breaths coming in quick bursts in the cold air. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, clunk. Lucy froze. Her shovel had struck something solid. Heart-pounding, she and Maggie clawed at the dirt until they uncovered the edges of a wooden box, the metal latch rusted with time. Maggie sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the sleeve of her jacket. "This is it," she whispered. Lucy hesitated only for a moment before prying open the latch. The lid creaked as it lifted, revealing a stack of yellowed photographs, aged papers, and a small leather-bound notebook. The air around them felt heavier, charged with something neither of them could name. Maggie picked up the first photo, a black-and-white image of 3 men standing in front of a grand building. One of the men, younger than the others, looked familiar. "That's Arthur," Lucy breathed. They flipped through the photographs, each one capturing moments from decades ago. But as they looked closer, a pattern emerged. Images of the same group of men, always together, always serious, some featuring Arthur at their center. Then came the documents. Maggie unfolded one of them carefully. It was an old letter, signed by multiple names. As she skimmed the words, her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Lucy, this is—" She stopped, taking a steadying breath. "It's a petition, a formal request to halt the construction of the town courthouse." Lucy frowned. Why would Arthur hide this? Maggie rifled through more papers, pulling out another document, this one bearing an official town seal. Her face paled as she read. "This wasn't just about stopping construction," she murmured. "Arthur and these men, they were trying to stop something bigger, and it looks like they failed." Lucy grabbed the notebook, flipping to the first page. Arthur's handwriting was there, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "They think they've buried the truth, but justice will rise. I will not let them erase what we did. If anyone finds this, know that the town you think you know was built on a lie." A gust of wind rustled the leaves around them, sending a shiver down Lucy's spine. Maggie met her gaze, fear flickering in her eyes. "This isn't just some town secret," she whispered. "Arthur uncovered something dangerous." Before Lucy could respond, a sound cut through the quiet, the sharp snap of a twig breaking nearby. Both sisters turned in unison, their hearts pounding. A shadow moved just beyond the tree line. Someone was watching them, and whoever it was, they knew exactly what Lucy and Maggie had just found. Chapter 9. A Face in the Dark. Maggie Reynolds paced the length of her small living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The weight of the metal lockbox in her hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the secrets it held were pressing down on her bones. Across the room, Lucy Harper perched on the edge of the couch, chewing her lip anxiously. "We should take this to Detective Calloway now," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This thing, it's dangerous." Maggie nodded but didn't move. The lockbox had been hidden for decades, buried beneath the floorboards of the old Grayson estate, sealed shut as if its contents had been waiting for someone to finally uncover them. That someone had been her. And now she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth it held. Before she could respond, a sudden crash from the back of the house made both women freeze. Maggie's heart slammed against her ribs. Her eyes darted to Lucy, whose face had drained of all color. "Someone's in the house," Lucy mouthed. Maggie didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Lucy's wrist and pulled her toward the coat closet. The space was barely big enough for both of them, but they squeezed inside, pressing their bodies into the darkness, just as hurried footsteps echoed through the house. The intruder was searching, no, tearing, through Maggie's things. The sound of drawers being yanked open, papers rustling, and objects clattering to the floor filled the air. Whoever it was, they were frantic, desperate. The lockbox. Maggie clutched it tightly against her chest, hardly daring to breathe. Her fingers trembled as she pressed them against the cool metal. She could feel Lucy shaking beside her, her breathing shallow and uneven. Through the narrow slats in the closet door, Maggie could make out a shadow moving through the living room. A tall figure, their face obscured by the dim lighting. They swept books off the shelves, overturned furniture, ripped apart cushions, and then the footsteps stopped. Maggie's pulse pounded in her ears. A long silence stretched between them, suffocating in its weight. Then, creak. The closet door handle twisted. Lucy sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers digging into Maggie's arm. The door inched open, and then a deafening bang shook the house. The shadowed figure jolted back, stumbling. Bright lights flashed through the windows, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Don't move!" Detective Calloway's voice rang through the house, sharp and commanding. The intruder hesitated for only a second before making a break for the back door. But Calloway was faster. With a swift tackle, the man was wrestled to the floor, his face pressing into the hardwood as the detective snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Maggie and Lucy stumbled out of the closet, both breathless, their hands still shaking. Calloway turned to them, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Are you two all right?" Maggie nodded numbly, her gaze fixed on the man pinned beneath Calloway. Dark hair, strong jaw, a haunted expression in his sharp, piercing eyes. The detective hauled him to his feet. "Thomas Grayson," he announced grimly. "Son of Robert Grayson." Maggie's stomach dropped. Robert Grayson, the man who had vanished decades ago, the man whose case had never been solved, the man whose secrets Maggie now held in her hands. Thomas's eyes flicked to the lockbox, his face twisted in frustration and something else, fear. "I had to find it," he rasped. "I had to know." Maggie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the box. Calloway's jaw tensed. "Know what?" Thomas's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, Maggie saw something raw and desperate beneath his anger. "The truth," he whispered. "What really happened to my father?" Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Because deep down she already knew. The truth was something none of them were ready for. Chapter 10. The Truth Unveiled. Detective Calloway gripped the worn leather folder tightly as he ascended the steps of City Hall. The building loomed over him, its grand columns casting long shadows in the fading evening light. Inside, he knew Mayor Hodges was waiting perhaps for the inevitable reckoning that had been creeping toward him for years. Calloway had spent months chasing whispers, following a trail that had long grown cold. But now, with Arthur Grayson's meticulously collected evidence, the truth was no longer just speculation. It was undeniable. Two uniformed officers flanked him as he pushed through the heavy oak doors of the mayor's office. Mayor Richard Hodges sat behind his desk, his normally composed demeanor cracking ever so slightly at the sight of Calloway's grim expression. "Detective," Hodges greeted, his voice tight. "To what do I owe this visit?" Calloway didn't bother with pleasantries. He dropped the folder onto the desk, the weight of its contents punctuating his next words. Arthur Grayson spent his last years hunting the truth, and he found it. Now, I have it too. Hodges's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. He hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside were old newspaper clippings, a list of names, handwritten notes, and the most damning piece. A faded photograph of 5 young men, arms slung around each other, standing beside a wrecked car. Hodges exhaled sharply, his face paling. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. "Not long enough for justice to forget," Calloway countered. The mayor closed the folder and rubbed his temple. "You have no idea what you're stepping into, Detective." "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Calloway leaned in, unyielding. For a long moment Hodges was silent. Then, with a defeated sigh, he began. It had been the summer of 1979. Richard Hodges, Thomas Grayson's father, Henry Grayson, and 3 other young men had been drinking by the lake outside of town. It was supposed to be a harmless night of fun, but by midnight everything had changed. Henry Grayson had argued with one of them, Brian Clements, a hot-headed troublemaker. Words escalated to shoving, and in the heat of the moment, Henry stumbled too close to the cliff's edge. No one saw the exact moment he fell. There was a frantic search. His body was never found, only the wreckage of his car near the bottom of the ravine. They told themselves that the authorities would assume Henry had been drunk, that it was an accident. They never spoke of it again. But Arthur Grayson never believed the official story. He spent decades collecting evidence, gathering statements, tracking down leads that no one wanted to remember. He knew Henry hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased. And now, Calloway had the final pieces of the puzzle. "You should have come forward," Calloway said after a long silence. Hodges chuckled bitterly. "And destroy everything, my career, my family, for something that happened 45 years ago? For something that still matters." Hodges exhaled slowly. "Arthur was close, you know. He was going to take this to the press, but before he could—" "He died," Calloway finished, his eyes narrowing. "How convenient." The mayor looked up sharply. "Arthur was an old man. People die. People also get silenced." Hodges shook his head. "I didn't touch Arthur. You think I'm capable of something like that?" "I think you've proven capable of covering up a crime for decades." The room fell into another tense silence. Then Hodges straightened, his face hardening. "So what now, Detective?" Calloway pulled out his phone. "Now, you come with me." But before he could make the call, the lights flickered, and then darkness. The office door burst open. A figure clad in black lunged toward Calloway. He barely had time to register the gleam of metal before something struck his head. Pain exploded in his skull. He stumbled, disoriented, as shouts echoed around him. Then a gunshot. The last thing he saw before the world turned black was Mayor Hodges, his eyes wide with something that looked an awful lot like fear. When Calloway woke, the first thing he noticed was the throbbing in his head. The second was the cold, hard floor beneath him. He blinked, trying to orient himself. The air smelled of damp concrete. He was underground, maybe a basement. Then he heard the voice. "You were getting too close, Detective." Calloway turned toward the sound. A figure stood in the shadows, only partially illuminated by a single flickering bulb. It wasn't Hodges. It was someone else. Someone he hadn't even considered. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. "Jesus," Calloway muttered. "It's you." The figure stepped forward, and Calloway finally saw their face. The last person he expected. And then everything went dark again. Chapter 11. A Town Restored. The morning after the final revelation, Willowbrook felt different. The town square, once clouded by uncertainty and suspicion, now hummed with a sense of renewal. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps with lighter hands, and conversations drifted through the streets with an ease that had been absent for too long. The weight of an unsolved mystery was gone, and in its place a quiet peace settled over the town. Mayor Hodges's resignation had been swift. There was no fanfare, no grand speech, just a simple statement left at town hall before he packed his bags and disappeared into the early morning mist. His tenure, tainted by secrets and half-truths, had finally come to an end. The town council, scrambling to restore order, assured the people that Willowbrook's future would be one of transparency and integrity. Thomas Grayson stood in the very office where, decades earlier, his father had once made decisions for the town's welfare. The old leather chair behind the desk was still there, its arms worn from years of service. He ran a hand over the polished wood, a lump forming in his throat. "My father wasn't a coward," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Maggie, standing in the doorway, nodded. "No, Thomas, he wasn't." The truth about Charles Grayson had finally come to light. His supposed disappearance had not been an act of shame, but rather one of sacrifice. He had uncovered corruption, and rather than let it consume him, he had sought to expose it. But in doing so, he had met a tragic end. His death had been covered up, twisted into a false narrative that had left his family in turmoil for years. Now, standing where his father had once stood, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The anger, the doubt, they were still there, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, there was a new resolve, a sense of purpose. He would ensure that his father's name was remembered for the right reasons. Maggie watched him, understanding his silent resolution. She had spent her own life searching for the truth, grasping at whispers and clues, trying to bring justice to the ones she loved. And now, in some way, she had done just that. But grief was not so easily resolved. As she walked back to the bookshop, Maggie felt the familiar ache of Arthur's absence. Though the case was closed and the truth was known, it did not bring him back. The love they had shared, the quiet moments of understanding, the way he had always known just what to say, those things would always be missing. Yet in a strange way, she felt closer to him now than she had since he passed. It was as if, in following the trail of secrets, she had walked a path he had once traveled himself. Arthur had always believed in the truth, and now Maggie had proven that no matter how deeply buried, it would always find its way home. The door to Maggie's book nook jingled as she entered, and Lucy looked up from behind the counter, a knowing smile on her face. "You look lighter," Lucy said, closing the ledger she had been working on. Maggie chuckled. "I suppose I do." Lucy poured 2 cups of tea and motioned for Maggie to sit. "So I was thinking," she began, a playful glint in her eye. "We should write about this." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Write about what?" "The case. Everything we uncovered. Arthur's notes. The mystery. People love a good detective story." Maggie hesitated. The thought of reliving it all on paper seemed daunting. But then, as she glanced around the shop, her eyes fell on the books that lined the shelves. Stories of heroes and heroines, of lost truths and found justice. Arthur had always said that stories mattered, that they had power. She exhaled slowly. "You really think people would read it?" Lucy grinned. "Are you kidding? This has everything. Scandal, secrets, a clever widow, an exasperated detective." Maggie laughed, shaking her head. "Detective Calloway would have a fit." As if summoned by his name, the bell above the door rang again, and in walked Detective Calloway himself. His expression was less stern than usual, almost amused. "Are you talking about me?" he asked, his voice dry. Lucy smirked. "Only good things, Detective." Calloway sighed, taking a seat across from Maggie. "I came to thank you," he said after a pause, "and to apologize." Maggie tilted her head. "For what?" "For not listening to you sooner." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "I should have trusted your instincts. I won't make that mistake again." Maggie smiled. "I'll hold you to that." He huffed a small laugh. "Somehow I don't doubt it." For a moment the 3 of them sat in a comfortable silence, the weight of the past few weeks slowly dissolving into something lighter, something hopeful. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting golden hues over the town. The streets of Willowbrook, once shadowed by uncertainty, now glowed with a renewed warmth. The town had weathered its storm. It had faced its ghosts and come out stronger. Maggie sipped her tea, watching the world outside her window. Life would go on. People would laugh, love and lose. Mysteries would come and go. But one thing would always remain, the truth. No matter how long it took, it would always find its way home. And that, Maggie thought, was something worth believing in.